What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites for bite sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. If you've ever participated in a sport, it's highly likely that you have entered this state that we're going to talk about today, which is the flow state. Flow state is essentially a state of consciousness where action and awareness kind of merge. And it's a balance because we don't want too much anxiety, but we also don't want to be understimulated and be bored. So most of the times when we hit flow state, we don't really kind of recognize that it's occurring, but we realize that things get a little bit easier. And it does happen a lot in sports and athletics, but this is also something that can happen within a workflow or even just recreational activity as well. I definitely know that based upon my own experience, I've gone out and done backpacking and just been walking and hit a flow state where kind of everything melts into this ease and low stress. And sometimes that means there's a large output that's occurring, which would be more in like the sport fashion, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. So, what actually is kind of happening is what we're going to go over today. And the flow state really kind of comes down to time dilation changes a little bit. Maybe things slow down. That's going to have to do with some of the hormones that are released during the flow state. And then also, the inner critic tends to kind of chill out, leave you alone, back off, not ride you so hard, and you don't really think too much about what you're doing and how you're doing it as much as it just kind of occurs, which is the whole point of the flow state, of course. Like I said, flow state occurs when our skill and demand are essentially perfectly balanced, and that allows for us to execute without much thought. So it does take a level of practice to kind of hit flow state. And when I say practice, it's not necessarily practicing the flow state itself, but more so practicing the activity or whatever it is that you're doing to master it to the point where your body can kind of go autonomic and take care of those actions. And a really good example of it happens a lot in sport, especially like action sports, where things are happening so quickly and decisions are made in essentially like a millisecond. Like selecting a line or moving your foot here when you're climbing or, whatever the case be. Usually those things happen very quickly and almost, as I said, autonomically without much thought, which thank goodness, because imagine if you're snowboarding or skiing or if you're on your mountain bike, dirt bike, and you're just mobbing and you're literally thinking about every single thing that you're doing and where you're putting yourself in position to go next. And if you think too long and hard about those things, you're likely going to miss the opportunity to hit a line, hit a rut, whatever the case be. And that's, obviously going to be problematic. But a lot of what kind of happens in the flow state too is since we are getting rid of the inner critic and we are kind of going into a state where we're not thinking about much, it's slightly meditative. And I know I definitely get that myself a lot when I'm going and racing dirt bikes, even though I'm not racing at like a crazy high level or anything. But that 12, 15 minutes of a race, nothing else kind of matters for me. I'm not thinking about what podcast I'm going to do on Monday. I'm not thinking about any financial situations, any business stuff. Not even thinking about what I'm going to eat next. So the only thing that really matters in that moment is what is occurring, and that definitely trips that flow state much more than if I have more time to think. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't hit the flow state and still be, thinking about whatever you're going to eat afterwards or whatever the case be. But it definitely happens a little bit more aggressively and a lot more easy when the demand of the sport or the activity makes you kind of be in that moment. And that's a lot of, like I said, what meditation kind of is like, what is happening in this moment? What is essentially going to help me move forward from this moment, not thinking about what was I just doing compared to what am I going to do in the future, but what is this present? What is this now? What's really cool about this too is that our prefrontal cortex, which essentially is our like that inner critic, that's what really kind of helps us with our self monitoring and also self doubt, unfortunately. But it's good to have that. But that is actually going to get turned off during a flow state. And that's because our prefrontal cortex makes a lot of decision making for us. And like I said, if we're thinking too much about what decision we're going to make next and we have milliseconds to work with, we're likely going to err and cause a problem. So the brain knows that it's actually better to rely upon its, you know, back storage area, whatever you want to call it, of the brain that is going to basically go off of what it's practiced previously, which is why practice can potentially make perfect. I don't want to say it does because if you don't practice perfect, then that can also be a problem. But if you do practice your activity on the regular and you're doing things that are going to help you be better at them, that's when you see that carry over much more in that flow state where, that millisecond time, your prefrontal cortex is shut off. You're not making that informed decision purposefully, but your brain is still going to know, okay, this is what we did. This is what I'm going to do in response to whatever that is. So I think that's kind of the neat thing about it as well, because it kind of comes from what we're doing in our practicing, in our training, whatever it is. And that's what's going to carry over into our flow state. So when you're feeling kind of doubtful about a training program or whatever it is that you're doing, it's really important to kind of look forward into those moments of when you're trying to hit flow, trying to compete at a high level. Now, like I mentioned, there's a lot of hormones that are basically being released during a flow state that can help to dilate time. It can help to increase focus and stuff like that. So we got the big ones coming in on this. We got our dopamine, neuroepinephrine, epinephrine. Those are essentially our adrenaline hormones, but all these are catecholamines, they're breakdown hormones. So it's something that is more stressful to the system. And so it's really kind of important to remember that because there are hormones that are more of a buildup or an anabolic build hormone like HGH, testosterone, and stuff like that. So we're not releasing those. Those are like something that come on the back end of doing things most of the times, but we do have that dopamine, we have the adrenaline hormones, we have serotonin, which obviously serotonin feels nice, helps give us kind of a blissfulness and kind of comes more post, but it still is something that we get from it. Meanwhile, dopamine is the molecule of more, so it makes us want more of something. Andrew Huberman on his podcast explained this really well, and I really kind of like this explanation of how dopamine actually works because a lot of time people think about dopamine, they're like, oh, well, like I'm getting a big release of dopamine when I'm doing something, but it's more so dopamine comes from the wanting of something over anything else. And the way he explained it was like a sandwich. So you have the best sandwich that you can possibly think of in your head. I'll describe mine. It's going to be like a sourdough. There's going to be steak. There's going to be like a pesto, maybe like a provolone cheese and roasted red peppers. I'll probably do like some pickled onion. Obviously, I'm just jonesing myself up for this, right? So I'm hyping myself up. Dopamine's being released at the thought of that sandwich. And so it's really high. Now it's going to kind of ride and drop a little bit as I go over time because I'm not getting that sandwich. But then when I think about it again, it's going to boost back up. And here's the problem with dopamine. If I get exactly what I wanted, all those ingredients that I mentioned on the sandwich, but it doesn't actually taste as good as I thought it did, that's a lot to do with the anticipation of dopamine actually being higher than what I get of dopamine when I actually experience it. So that's kind of a fun way of thinking about dopamine and why it's a molecule of more, makes you want more rather than it actually being something that is released like during, specific activities and stuff like that. And one that I did leave out is endorphins. Endorphins, super important, make you feel good. Something that a lot of runners might experience with a quote unquote runner high. There's kind of a euphoric feeling that happens with endorphins and definitely something that happens a lot just with physical activity in general. So I think it's really kind of important to make sure I throw those in there. So missed on that, but super, fun thing that we can look at is just like flow state really is occurring due to the cascade of hormones that are being released in the brain to kind of manipulate, our state of mind and also what we're doing. So according to Steven Kotler, there is four stages of flow. If you practice them, you're essentially training yourself to be able to hit your flow state. So that's kind of a cool thing to know that you can train this. But the first stage of it is struggle. I don't really think I have to explain too much about struggle. because it's going to be something, maybe you're doing something new. I have a client that is I'm dipping his toes into Olympic lifting. He's working on the power clean. It's not really going well. He's struggling with it. It doesn't feel good. He's not really liking it. And he messages me. He's like, I don't think it's for me. And I'm like, dude, if you give up on something after doing it twice in your life, where would you be right now? Right. So that struggle is where most people will basically take the exit away from whatever it is that they're doing. Of course, for him, I told him exactly what I just said, and he's going to stick with it. It's going to get better. But early on, we don't like being bad at things. We definitely like to excel at the things that we're doing well, and we like to avoid the things that we don't do well. And that's definitely not going to help with any sort of growth for anyone, but especially for this flow state, we must have that struggle in the beginning and we must overcome that struggle. Now, the next stage of flow state is the release. So you basically let go. This is where the inner critic can really kind of quiet down and you can detach yourself from what this ever the struggle is that you're struggling with. And your brain will actually shift its brain waves at this point to go from more of a negative to a positive. And that allows you to obviously get a bigger rush of hormones and go, wow, like I actually feel better about what I'm doing. Maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not great, but you did just overcome this huge hurdle essentially with the struggle phase to be in that release phase. And now you can focus your eyes forward, focus your brain on what you're doing and go, okay, I can see that improvement. I can see that I'm getting better. And that's going to help you get closer and closer to that flow state as well. The third stage is flow itself. So that's when we get deep engagement, time will slow down a little bit, and we're starting to run on autonomic senses essentially. And the brain will once again make a shift to a different wavelength. But ultimately, what's happening is your performance is going to increase. And that's what we want. We want performance increase. We want to go from overcoming a struggle, having a release from that struggle so that we can jump forward again into the flow state and actually see the fruit of our labor, see what we've been working towards. And in that moment, too, I say see, but it's so funny because you unlikely will kind of recognize that's happening until the fourth stage, which is recovery. And you're actually going to be able to take a rest from it, look back and kind of reflect on everything that just happened and go like, whoa, like I wasn't even trying and my time got better. I wasn't really trying and I was able to hit this line that I've been worried about all day, whatever the case be. And it's also important to note that the brain is such a powerhouse to the body and it uses a lot of fuel. So for it to kind of shut off an area, it's going to likely be pulling a lot of energy from other areas. And so that recovery is also going to be really important because you got to give it a break. But with every time that we stress the body, and this goes for our muscular system, goes for our skeletal system, nervous system, in the brain itself, which is part of the nervous system, of course. But when we give a hormatic, purposeful stressor to it, it's going to adapt and it's going to improve as long as we actually execute our recovery so that it can get better. But if we don't give it the recovery, which most of the times, if I'm saying recovery, I'm really talking about sleep. So if we don't get our sleep, if we don't get recovered, it's very likely that we're going to counteract a lot of the good stuff that we're doing and not get the big benefits that we're looking for. And so, sum that up, go to sleep, recover, please. Otherwise, your flow state's going to get jacked up, but obviously a lot of other stuff, which I've gone over in many of my other podcasts. So it's probably not the first time you've heard me really banter and push sleeping, of course. So Kotler also has a trigger system essentially to practice flow and do it consistently and make it stronger, make it better for yourself. So what one of those is challenging your skill ratio. So if I'll use a runner for example, we'll keep it simple. So if you're a runner and you're trying to improve your running form, you're going to essentially try and push about 4% past what you're capable of. And that could be form oriented or it could be, a time, whatever it is. But the goal is to not reach so far or have a goal of reaching so far that you can't obtain it because that's obviously discouraging. And you also want to have just enough kind of like what I was talking about with the hormetic stress. We're looking for just enough to trigger response and adaptation. So, looking about 4% of an improvement over what you typically are doing is going to ultimately lead to you getting better. And it's also going to help increase your chances of reaching flow state. Now, the next one is risk, and we must risk it a little bit. You have to get out of your comfort zone. The body wants to stay where it's comfortable, but we have to purposefully push it past where it wants to go. And that kind of sits into that 4% more. But at the same time, risk is always going to be a ratio of risk reward. So it's important to kind of look at, okay, is this risk worth taking? Is this risk going to injure me? Is this risk going to do something that's going to be negative towards my overall goals? So it's really kind of important to look at that and go, okay, I want to risk it a little bit. What can I do calculated that's going to help me get a little bit uncomfortable, but not so uncomfortable that I'm out of control, essentially? Early on in the podcast, I talked about how it can't be boring. So, to reach flow state, we need to have enough stimulus that something isn't going to be boring. So, having some novelty, some complexity to what it is that we're doing is going to help us basically be excited about what we're doing. And, I've been having people come out and sprint with me. And I think that's where a lot of people are kind of excited. It's like it's different, it's something new because most people are familiar with running. But a lot of people haven't sprinted in years, probably since they're like high school or even younger. So to give access to something that is novel and different, obviously it's great for their physiology, but also it's great for the psychology. And that's where having the novelty really is cool, is because it does check both those boxes of psychology and physiology. Now, this is one that I'm actually going to add in, and I really think it's important because ego gets this kind of this nasty rap, right? Like, oh, don't have ego, be humble, don't be cocky, all this stuff. And all that is very true in certain settings. And there's a really good book by Ryan Holiday, Ego's the Enemy. I don't fully believe that ego is the enemy, especially if you're somebody like myself that is an entrepreneur, an athlete, somebody that really kind of thinks and believes in themselves to a level that they can go out and perform and try and beat other people. Like you do need to have some ego, but it does need to remain in check, of course. But I do think that if you're trying to accomplish a flow state, you really need to believe that you're one of the better individuals doing this activity. And even if you're not, like, I'm not saying you have to be a world record level individual, but you need to believe that you're good at what you do. And you need to allow your ego to kind of boost you to that point to where you're able to perform at a high state and let your body kind of just do what it's going to do and let your mind do what it's going to do. Otherwise, if you're like, "Oh, well, I'm not really sure about this. I don't really know if I should be doing it," or like, "I don't know what action I should take here." That's all of that prefrontal cortex is taking over. And if we're trying to shut that off so flow state can occur, then we're obviously not going to accomplish our flow state. So, there's a lot to that, but I really kind of wanted to add that in. Like I said, it's not a part of Kotler's research and stuff, but it's really kind of something that I think about a lot and something I've had conversations about that I think should be kind of thought about and looked at by other people as well. Is like ego can really help you get to a place that you never thought you were going to be. Because at the end of the day, intrinsic motivation is always going to work better than an extrinsic motivation. So if we're waiting for somebody to hype us up so that we can do something, you might be waiting for a very long time. So find that inner ego, control it, utilize it, and then that can ultimately help you reach your flow state. And lastly, these are the massive benefits of being able to reach a flow state. Now, I've talked about it from an athletic perspective, but I also mentioned this can happen in work. It can happen just out and about when you're just doing things. And that's going to be a productivity increase of about 5 times because you're just flowing through what you're doing. You're going to have a learning speed that's about 2 to 3 times faster, which is pretty darn cool. Creativity increases by about 400% or by 4 times. So these are all really great things. And like I said, this isn't just to do with athletics. It can also do with life. It can do with work. So, kind of, as I said, working on building the flow state using the tools that we went over throughout this podcast and really just building yourself, recovering and stuff like that. I really believe is going to help a lot of people. And shoot, if you're an entrepreneur like me or you have entrepreneurial goals, flow state is where it's at to help get you there. So, thank you so much for listening, watching, sticking around to the end. And, if you have questions, please reach out. Obviously, outlierathlete.com. You can get to me there, or you can go through social media at Outlier Athlete. And yeah, thanks so much. Like it, subscribe, comment, all that jazz. And I'll see you in the next one.